Hi everyone, my name is Catherine Moravec and I'm with Colorado Springs Utilities. Thank you for joining us for spring landscape cleanup. I'm excited that you're here. Colorado Springs Utilities is proud to offer the community programs and resources to help you use water wisely. So let's get right into it. So believe it or not, spring is here. It's amazing how quickly winter transitions into spring in the Pikes Peak region as soon as we get some warm temperatures. So as these plants are starting to come out of dormancy, it is a beautiful time of year to get out in the yard and work on making it an enjoyable place for yourself all summer. So as you see your friends and neighbors out in their yards busy taking care of all sorts of tasks, you may be wondering, what should you really be doing to care for your landscape in spring? And that's what I'm going to be covering today. Here are the topics that we're going to be covering. I'm a horticulturist, and these are the steps that I use to clean up landscapes, and this is exactly the order in which I do it. First, I cut plants back. Second, I prune shrubs. Then I rake up all the debris. I top off and replenish the wood mulch areas. I work on preventing weeds for later in the growing season, and then water and aerate lawns. And I'm going to be sharing with you the steps and details that I use so that you can be empowered to take action in your own landscape. All right, so the first thing we're going to be talking about is cutting back garden plants. This is the first thing I do when I go into a landscape to clean it up in the spring. Before we talk about how to do it, I just want to share with you which plants are we talking about in the first place. So there are really two primary groups. First, the ornamental grasses, and second, the perennial flowers. Ornamental grasses are just simply those grasses that we let grow to their full height and glory in the landscape rather than a lawn grass, which we would be mowing on a regular basis. In this photograph, you can see three beautiful ornamental grasses on the right-hand side of the photo. The second group that we would be cutting back is the perennial flowers. The perennial flowers are those that produce stems and leaves and flowers during the growing season. It dies back to the ground level over the winter and then regrows from the base in the following year. So as we're going and cutting these grasses and perennial flowers back, we need some tools. So here are some tools that you may wish to use. If you have just a few plants that you need to cut back, then a pair of hand pruners just might be the perfect thing for you. Those are the ones with the orange handle. Now, if you have some larger ornamental grasses that you need to cut back, you might find that a pair of head shears with its longer blades and longer handles might be really useful to you. If you have a lot of plants to cut back, then you may want to invest in a pair of gas-powered or electric-powered hedge trimmers. These can make cutting back plants really easy and really fast. So the general principle that you want to keep in mind when you're going out to cut back your grasses and your perennials is cut back the dead material, remove that from the landscape, and leave the living material to grow to its full glory throughout the growing season. Now in the Pikes Peak region, if you're getting out to do your spring cleanup in February or March, then when you're going out to cut these plants back, they may have had last year's growth completely die back, but there's no new growth emerging from the base of the plant. If you're doing it at this stage, then go ahead and cut all of last year's growth down to ground level. This can give you the cleanest look because you're removing as much of last year's growth as possible. Now, if you're going out and cutting back your plants and you start to notice that there's green leaves at the base of the plant, don't cut those because you want to let those grow and produce the beautiful growth that you're looking forward to this summer. So instead of that, instead of cutting everything back to ground level, what you can do is look at the height of that new growth by looking at the height of the tips of the green leaves and then cutting last year's growth right above that. What will happen is that as that new growth emerges and grows up, it will cover all those brown stems and you'll never know that they're there. So this can be a great technique for plants like columbines or other early plants that produce leaves, as soon as the weather starts to warm up. Another thing that you can do is if you're working with a plant and you notice that the stems from last year are pretty loose, you might just even pull them right off the plant and leave that green growth in place. Sometimes if the stems are really brittle, you can also go in and snap them with your fingers, and that's a really good technique if you've got new growth emerging as well. So whether those plants are greening up because they green up early, or maybe it's because you just got to your spring cleanup a little later than you normally would, if you do see that green growth, cut right above it. Now, as you drive around town, you may notice that in a lot of landscapes, you'll see ornamental grasses cut back to a height of 12 to 18 inches. And you may be wondering if that's the correct height to cut them back to, because if you cut them lower, you might be actually damaging something. Well, that's not the case. If you don't see any green growth, then go ahead and cut it all the way back to ground level. You're not going to hurt anything. And here's the reason why. When an ornamental grass grows, the growth that it produces for the growing season dies all the way back to the ground. So if you leave 12 to 18 inches of growth, and then you've got new leaves coming up from the base, they're going to mix together and create sort of this brown-green appearance that looks, not as great as it could for the whole entire growing season. So instead of that, you can either cut the grass all the way back to the ground, or you just cut it right above the green leaves if you got to a little bit later, and just remove as much of the dead material as possible and leaving the live growth as intact as you can. Now here's a group of plants that can get a little confusing. These are called the subshrubs. They're plants like Russian sage, blue mist spirea, and even rabbit brush. What you'll notice about these plants is when you go out into the landscape in March and April, they will have died back part of the way. So they're not like a true perennial that dies back all the way to the ground, and they're not like a regular shrub that doesn't die back at all. So we need to treat these plants a little bit differently, and let me show you a few options that you can use. When you're cutting back subshrubs, there are really 3 different options depending on how detailed you want to get. The first option is to cut back just simply that outer 1/3 of the plant. You can do that with a hedge trimmer, you can do it with just a hand pruner. It doesn't really matter how you do it, but what you're doing is just taking off the outer 1/3 of the plant so that it can regrow from mostly live branches. Now this is an option that works really well. In some winters, you'll find that the branches may die back farther than a third. And that typically happens in winters where we have a lot of cold weather. In that case, what you may want to do instead is kind of eyeball the plant and look along the stem to see where you see those tiny new leaves emerging. You'll find that there's new leaves emerging from the base up to a certain portion of the stem, and then no leaves above that. And just like you would do with the perennial, you just cut right above the new leaves, removing the dead portion of the branches and leaving the live growth in place. So this can be a good method if you want to be a little bit more targeted, or if we have an unusual winter that causes more dieback than we would expect. Now, if you have a subshrub that is old and getting ratty and looks pretty gangly looking, one option is to take the whole entire plant back to ground level. This sounds like a dramatic technique, but what you will do is remove all of that older growth, and then new stems will start to emerge from the base of the plant that will be much more uniform and much more fresh. We call this rejuvenation. So this can be a good technique if you want to rejuvenate your plants. It seems like it would be damaging to them, but it's actually not. And that's the third option that you might want to use for your subshrubs. Now we've talked about ornamental grasses and perennials and subshrubs in general. If you have a question about a specific plant in your yard, then go to waterwiseplants.org. This is our online plant database that has wonderful information. In fact, once you get to the specific plant page for the plant in which you're interested in, the fourth heading is actually the maintenance tab, and that's where you're going to find information about how to take care of that specific plant. This can be a wonderful resource for you. Well, now that we've talked about cutting plants back, let's move on to pruning shrubs. March is a wonderful month to prune your shrubs, and here are 3 reasons why. First of all, it's very important to cut your shrubs before the buds come out, and March is a wonderful month to do that. Second, because we typically don't have leaves on the plants in March, you can see the branch structure much more clearly, which helps you do a better job at pruning. And in March, even though it still might be cold, we're not likely to get a deep freeze that will damage the pruned branches that you've cut. So as I said, March is really the ideal month to go out and prune your shrubs. Here, once again, you're going to need some tools. You might once again use just a simple pair of hand pruners, but if you need a pruner with longer handles, you might want to use a lopper, which is the one with the blue handles in the photograph. If you've got thicker branches, you may actually need to use a hand pruning saw, or if you have really big branches, you might even need to use a chainsaw. Now, when you're going out and pruning shrubs, you don't need to know exactly what type of shrub you're working with, but you do need to know if it's a thin branch shrub or a thick branch shrub. Now, you don't need to know the name of the shrub, just look at it and you'll be able to tell. If you have a shrub that has a lot of thin branches coming up from ground level and most of the branches are less than 1 inch in diameter, I would categorize that as a thin branched shrub. If, on the other hand, you have a lot of branches that are bigger than 1 inch in diameter and a very beautiful branching pattern, then that's going to be a thicker branch shrub. So let's talk about how you prune thin branch shrubs first. All right, so you go out, you've got your loppers, you're ready to go. The main general rule that you want to keep in mind is to cut out about 1/3 of the total number of branches in the plant. When you remove those branches, just cut them right off at ground level. Now you'll be able to tell the older branches because they're thicker and they typically have a more gray color to their bark. The thinner branches with the brighter colored bark are the younger ones. By cutting out the older 1/3 of branches every year, you're making space for those new branches to emerge from the base of the plant and the branches that are younger to be the beautiful, healthy growth of that shrub. So that's a great general rule. Remove 1/3 of the older branches every March. Now, if you have a thin branch shrub that is looking a little bit scraggly, it's got a lot of old growth in it, maybe a lot of dead branches, you can use the same rejuvenation technique that we talked about for subshrubs. So in this case, you just take all of the branches, 100% of them, down to ground level. Now this does require a lot of energy for the plant to regrow from the base. So you only want to do this every 3 to 7 years and then give it time to recover. But if you do this with an older, scraggly looking shrub, you'll get this beautiful new uniform growth that will really surprise you. Now let's talk about thicker branch shrubs. These are the shrubs that have bigger diameter branches and typically a lot of branching patterns. Rather than just simply taking out 1/3 of the older branches, you want to be a little bit more targeted in your approach. If you just go in with a pair of loppers and start taking the older branches down to ground level, then you're likely to create a lot of gaps or big holes in the shrub that are going to make it look a little awkward. So instead of using that technique, what we do instead is kind of selectively choose which branches we want to cut out. And those may be branches that are dead, maybe branches that are old and not vigorous anymore, and maybe some branches that are just too close together. This is where you're just using your artistic eye and selectively removing portions of the plant that are not quite that attractive anymore. When you're doing this type of pruning, the main guideline that you want to keep in mind is to always cut those branches at a branch crotch. Do not cut the branches in the middle of the branch because you'll get a lot of witch's brooming and the plant won't be able to seal that up. So instead, cut at a branch crotch. It doesn't matter if that's at the top of the plant or the bottom of the plant, just always get to a place where the branches are joining and then remove the smaller branch in that case. Now, when you're pruning these thicker branch shrubs, once you get out the dead, the declining, and the branches that are just too close together, then you can really use your artistic eye to remove portions of the plant that are not that sightly. So maybe you want to shape the plant into a more narrow form. Well, all you have to do is cut off some of the branches on the exterior. Or maybe you want to cut off some of the branches at the very ground level to just give it a little bit of a vase shape. You can do that. Or if you maybe want to open up the center of the branch to get more airflow to the center of the plant, then you just selectively prune out those branches that are going to achieve that goal. And that's how you can use pruning to make those shrubs have the artistic look and the function that you want them to have in the landscape. Now that we've talked about pruning shrubs, let's talk about raking up debris. So when I go out into a landscape to do spring cleanup, I typically will cut everything back, all the perennials and the ornamental grasses, then do my hand pruning of shrubs, and then I give the area a good rake. Now, if you have mulch in the area, wood mulch, you probably don't want to rake all that up because you want it to stay in place. So the areas we really want to rake up are your lawns, your ground cover areas, and your rock areas. So let's talk about lawns first. You know, usually in spring we recommend cutting it short one time just to remove the brown growth of the grass, and then setting your mower as high as possible for the rest of the growing season. But after you do that one short cutting, then you can rake over your lawn and remove a lot of the brown leaves, and that'll just give you a more beautiful lawn green up in the spring. Another area that's really great to rake is an area where you've got a lot of ground covers. Ground covers like thyme and veronica, it's not practical to shear those back with hedgers. So instead, by using a rake, it takes a lot of the brown leaves out and you leave those green leaves in place. And they seem to be able to handle quite a vigorous raking. The third area that I like to rake typically is a rock area. So these are areas where we typically get windblown leaves accumulating, and great areas to just rake that up and remove it from the landscape. So after you've cut everything back, you've done your pruning, and you've raked the area, you can end up with a significant amount of debris. We at the demonstration garden, we like to collect all that debris on tarps or in puncture-proof bags, and then we transport it either to home compost piles or to landscape recycling yards. And that's a great option because it keeps all that material out of the landfill. Okay, now that you've got all the debris removed from the landscape, it's time to move on to replenishing wood mulch. Wood mulch areas are a great part of our landscape, and I find that although you can add wood mulch to your landscape any time of year, the easiest time to do it is after your plants are all cut back and pruned. And the reason for that is that's when the plants are at their smallest size for the growing season, and it's a lot easier to maneuver in between them and get that mulch in place. So you want to add mulch to any existing mulch areas so that when you're finished, that layer will be 3 to 4 inches thick. And that's where you're going to get all the benefits of preventing weeds that wood mulch does for us. So it's perfectly fine to add new mulch on top of existing mulch. You might want to just move it around with your hand to blend the two layers a little bit so that there's not quite the same contrast between the two products. But in a few weeks, you'll never know, and your plant beds will be ready for spring. So let's talk about preventing weeds. Now, in March in the Pikes Peak region, we typically don't have a lot of weeds actively growing, but it's a great time to put down weed preventer to save yourself lots of time and energy during the summer. So even those weeds are not actively growing, believe me, Those seeds are waiting for the right germination temperature to come out and start growing vigorously. So you can put down weed preventer in the spring. It's just simply a product that you sprinkle over the area and water it in. And then once it's in place, it will stop new weeds from germinating from seed for about 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the product you choose. It doesn't kill existing weeds that are just simply regrowing from the roots, but it will prevent new weeds from growing from seed. I find this is most helpful in gravel areas or dry stream beds where you have unplanted rock that gets a lot of new weeds growing from seed every year. Now, in order to get weed preventer, you can go to your local garden center or nursery. They should have both organic and conventional options available there. Now, even though the weeds aren't growing in March, that is the time you want to put down weed preventer because it needs to be in place before those weeds start to grow. So anytime around March 15th until the end of March is a great time to put it down to prevent spring weeds. Now keep in mind it lasts for about 4 to 8 weeks. So if you want to prevent the summer weeds from growing as well, you might want to put down a second application in early June. All right, now that we've talked about preventing weeds, let's move on to spring lawn care. One of the best things you can do for both your trees and your lawns is to make sure they have enough water in the spring before you turn on your sprinkler system. As you know, Colorado winters can be very dry, and in March, that's when these trees and lawn areas are starting to form the roots that they're going to have for the entire growing season. So by making sure that the soil is moist, you're giving those lawn roots and tree roots a great place to grow. So we recommend watering every 2 to 4 weeks in March and April if the weather is dry. You can use a watering wand like that's pictured here in the photo, or you can even use a hose and sprinkler until you turn on your sprinkler system. Just make sure you disconnect the hose from the spigot after you're done so you prevent freeze damage. Watering your lawns is really great for them in the spring. The two main problems that we see with lawns in the Pikes Peak region in the spring are what we call winter kill and mite damage. Now, winter kill is just simply dehydration injury from the grass being so dry over the winter that you start to get brown patches occurring. This is very common in especially sunny areas, sloped areas, and areas where there's a lot of reflected heat. So by simply giving that lawn a good drink periodically, you can prevent dehydration injury or winter kill. Now, not every year do we get mite damage, but it does show up every few years. And mites are these little tiny critters that get into your lawn area in March and April. They do like warm lawn areas, so sunny, sloped, and reflected heat areas as well. And they will chew on the grass and create big brown patches. Now, the good news is that there's no need to go out and buy any chemical to prevent mites because water works really, really well. So if you're able to provide your lawn with a good watering periodically in March and April, that will prevent mite damage. So if you're able to go out and give your lawn a good watering in March and April, that will prevent not only dehydration, but also mite damage. Beyond that, there's nothing special that you need to apply to your lawn in March or April. Now, if we happen to get a really good snowstorm or snow/rainstorm, then Mother Nature is watering our lawns for free, and then you can delay watering until that area starts to dry out. Another wonderful practice for your lawn in the spring is to core aerate it. Core aeration is simply driving over the area with a core aeration machine. This machine pulls plugs out of the ground and deposits them on the surface. This is a really great practice for your lawn because as we walk on our lawn areas over the summer, that top layer of soil gets compacted. And core aeration breaks that up and lets more air and water move deeper into the soil. That allows the lawn to grow healthy, strong roots, and you'll have a beautiful green lawn. The best time to core aerate your lawn in the spring is when it's actively growing, so April into mid-May is perfectly fine to do it. Don't do it in midsummer when it's starting to go slightly dormant. Now you may wonder if I'm going to talk about lawn fertilization. Lawn fertilization is a great thing to do in spring, but you just don't want to do it too early. If you fertilize your lawn too early, that will cause its roots to stunt, and that, because they're short, will make it much more likely that you'll see drought stress in the summer. So even though you'll see all your neighbors out fertilizing, wait until the later part of April, or even better, the first 2 weeks of May to fertilize. And by that time, your lawn will be actively growing, it'll be ready to accept that fertilizer, and it'll be ready to grow deep, strong, healthy roots. All right, so those are the 6 steps that I use to spring clean up landscapes in the Pikes Peak region. We have talked about cutting plants back. We have talked about the basics of pruning shrubs. We've talked about the value of raking up all that debris at the end of that process. We've talked about how you can add wood mulch to your plant beds. We've talked about preventing weeds, and we've talked about the basics of watering and aerating your lawn. These are the 6 essential things that you need to do for your landscape in the spring. If you're able to tackle these, you will be well on your way to having a beautiful and healthy yard that you can enjoy all summer. Thank you very much for joining us, and please be sure to check out our additional webinars and WaterWise landscape resources at csu.org.